No on it. Thank you, sir. Opposition witnesses have 6 minutes left.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Melissa Floyd. I'm a data analyst and educator for the last 15 years, specializing in mathematics. I quickly need to say that opposition to this bill is not an opposition to vaccination. No one here is suggesting that we stop the vaccination program, and that's important. We've heard that AB 2109 is working. We know that vaccine rates are up and personal belief exemptions are down. In fact, in 1 year, they've decreased 19%. Now, 277 aims to completely eliminate that narrowly used exemption, which encompasses 2.5% of children in California, most of whom are partially vaccinated. They are misclassified as unvaccinated. In fact, less than 1% of children in California are completely unvaccinated. That is just not enough to affect the community immunity levels of our state. The bill authors have continued to perpetuate the idea that California schools are not safe and that PBEs are the reason, but I'm here to provide the facts that will state otherwise. Number one, the authors have said that over 100,000 people die of measles every year. But what they're not telling you is those are global numbers. The CDC says not one person has died in California or in our entire country in 12 years. The United States has a population of 330 million people, and there has not been one death in over a decade. Also, measles contagion ratio is 12-1. What that means is our first 100 cases should have been 1,200 cases and then would have been 14,000 cases and grown exponentially. But it didn't. And why didn't it? Because our vaccination rates and our community immunity is high. And we have these excellent quarantine measures in place. The outbreak was contained in a number of weeks. There was no public health crisis and certainly no epidemic. You've heard Dr. Gordon testify about pertussis or whooping cough, and only 10% of the kids last year in California were unvaccinated. The reason this is so important to understand is because these outbreaks cannot be blamed on the unvaccinated children, and eliminating that PBE is not going to eliminate the pertussis problem. Let's address this pockets of low vaccination we keep hearing about. The idea of pockets does not take into account the size of schools, districts, or counties. In other words, PBE percentages are all relative. One single unvaccinated child carries different weight depending on the class size. So one student in a class of 100 has a 1% PBE rate, and that's not a cause for alarm according to the authors. One child in a class of 10 has a 10% PBE rate, and that's considered a significant risk. But we're still talking about the same one child. Also, the distortion of data takes these small sample sizes, and what it does is it represents them as data for larger populations and as a whole, which is inaccurate. Important to note, there is no correlation between the PBE percentage rate and the incidence of disease. LA County has a PBE rate of 1.62%. That's very low. And they had almost 30 cases of measles. Marin County, on the other hand, has over 6.5% PBE, and they had 2 cases. The same can be said about pertussis last year. 3 of the 7 counties that had the most cases were over 95% vaccination coverage. So there is no connection here between PBE percents and incidence of disease. Rather, it is random and geographical. I ask you to look at the facts because the facts are clear. There is no public health crisis. Please oppose this bill.
Thank you. Next witness.
My name is Bianca Lara Amon. I'm a preschool teacher and administrator in Southern California. There are so many issues that have not been addressed in the implementation of SB 277, most of it falling on the school districts and administrators. There is also an inequity for me as I look at my classroom as an early childhood teacher. Right now, as an early childhood teacher, I currently handle bodily fluids with the children that I work with. Right now, I am required to accept children who have HIV, AIDS, hepatitis. Also, 2 bills passed in the Senate and Assembly, SB 445 and AB 982, also require that in my classroom I accept children that are homeless without a vaccination records. That another bill also allows these homeless families to opt out on a religious belief exemption. So those children will be accepted in my classroom. However, most of the children that are in my classroom that are on a PBE actually have more immunizations than most of us individually in this room. They will be eliminated from my classroom, though they are healthy. These bills that have been passed that demonstrate, make me question whether or not this bill is really tied to the necessary community immunity. When we are allowing religious exemptions for some, we are allowing entry to school without vaccinations for some, but SB 277 would remove that for others. That's why I oppose this bill.
15 more seconds.
I would also add that homeschool networks are currently moving.
But you may.
Homeschool networks are currently being arranged with families, and my concern is that this bill won't serve the ultimate goals. AB 2109 requires that parents meet with physicians
Please wrap
every
up. You're
year.
at time.
If they're in homeschools, they will not.
Thank you. Okay, at this time, I'm going to ask a few of the witnesses who are you want to put up to start to answer some of the questions from members be on this side. I'm going to ask witnesses in support. You can have a few come up and sit on the right hand side of Dr. Pan. Other expert witnesses can be ready to come to the mic as members have questions that you may be best suited to answer. And we are now going to go to member questions and comments. Let's start with Assemblymember Bonilla.
Thank you very much. And I do want to start by thanking you, Dr. Pan, for accepting the amendments. The issue of relying more upon the physician's judgment for the medical exemption, I think, is very, very important. The scope of this bill is pulling back so strongly on the parental options that I think it's only it's really necessary to expand the physician's latitude around the medical exemption. And I appreciate you taking that amendment. And secondly, the amendment on special education. Yes. I have had a lot of concerns about education. I will just state personally that I think that this bill could have benefited from being heard in an education committee setting. I say that as a teacher myself. And I think there still are unresolved issues around education and how this is going to be implemented to ensure that every child is able to have the education that is due them here in California. So that is an ongoing underlying concern I have that I think we're going to need to continue to look at. But the issue I want to ask you about is one that I haven't heard a lot of discussion in following the bill, and that is around the child care piece, the 0 to 5. I have a lot of concerns. My concerns are about single-parent homes that are put in a position of, and perhaps single-parent homes that don't have a great deal of resources and options in front of them, and feel that they're put in a position that is has some inequities compared to perhaps other families. In my attempt to work around that concern I have, I wanted to ask you a question about the flexibility that families would be able to have if they were being given a conditional admittance to daycare, child care setting. Could you please give your explanation of how the conditional admittance works? And then I would just ask if I could ask a follow-up question based on your response.
Okay. Well, first of all, I appreciate your question, Senator Bonilla, and as you know, this bill was heard in Senate Education Committee. It was not my decision, but the decision of the Rules Committee for the Assembly to decide which committees would be heard in the State Assembly. I appreciate your question about conditionals. Basically, as a pediatrician, I've written many conditionals for patients because you have patients who may not have received their immunizations in a timely manner for various reasons, and that if they, when they are ready for admittance to school or to child care, then we work with the parents, and I will write a note to the daycare. I guess that would basically state that we are working with the family to get their child immunized to meet the standard that's required by the law, and that working with the parents that we are working to achieve that, and that notation has usually been accepted by the. I've never had one rejected by a school or a daycare.
Just to follow up through the chair, I understand that in the current regulations there is a way to commence the schedule for someone who hasn't. My concern really is about the flexibility within the current regulations that the Department of Health has, and would like to be able to continue that discussion with you on ensuring the fact that the doctor would not have this, what I'm hoping is an expanded judgment around the medical exemption, but also an expanded judgment around alternate schedules beyond just what is printed in the current regulations. And that's something that I think is very important and critical as we look at the daycare and child care issue.
I appreciate that. As you know, the law itself is silent on specific schedules. Obviously, by the time you actually enter school or daycare, they expect that the child would be up to date based on the recommended schedule. However, even in those cases, as I mentioned before, a physician can work with the family and actually provide a conditional saying that we have worked with the parents and the child is going to be receiving their immunizations that will be required over the period of time, and so that's generally been found acceptable by the education facilities. And
I would just like to make sure that I'm clear with you on that. If this bill passes out and if we're on before it goes to the floor for a vote, I would just want to be able to reserve the right to make sure we're actually clear on what we both mean by flexible scheduling in those first 5 years.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Assemblymember Burke.
My question is similar to Assemblywoman Bonilla's. I have a daughter who's 11 months old, and we did choose to do a reduced schedule. And so I just want to make sure, because the opposition led to the belief that that would no longer be an option. I just want to be clear. When you say that I can, for my case in particular, I could get a conditional acceptance, that I want to make clear, is that on the entire list of vaccinations that she's supposed to get? Does she actually have to start the series of each one to get that conditional?
So the conditional is a declaration of the intention that the child is going to get the vaccinations that will be required by law. And so that's basically, as a physician, I would be declaring to the school. And I would just also point out that for school, I know you mentioned, but for school, most of the recommended vaccines are actually recommended for years before they actually enter school. There are a couple of vaccines that are required for child care, not all 10 that are listed. There's a couple of them. And so what happens is that basically you're telling the school that you are getting the child vaccinated, that you have worked with the family to get the vaccinated to the point where as much as that they can receive the vaccine, that work with the family, and that you are, even though they have not actually achieved the requirement, that you are working with the family with the intention to actually achieve that requirement when in the near future, and that therefore that's why they should be permitted to start school now and that they can continue to attend.
Can I ask a follow-up question? I just have a follow-up question.
Assemblymember Burke.
I just want to make sure I understood. You said that there are a few vaccinations that are required for child care, but that's not according to this particular bill, or is it?
No, the vaccine requirements have not been changed in terms of which vaccines are required at what time in this particular bill. It's based on previous actions of this legislature. Every single vaccine that's required in the state of California has been passed by this legislature and signed by a governor. So that none have actually been imposed by the Department of Public Health, even though that's a pre-existing power of that department. It's not one that we've changed in this bill, although we did say that they would be able to get, if it's actually a departmental imposed one, to get personal belief exemption. So all 10 have been approved by the legislature. And so there are some that say that you need to get it for child care, and there are others that really aren't commenced until entry into school at kindergarten.
Right, but Dr. Pan, I believe the current the way that the procedure works is that the conditional permit basically expresses the intent to become vaccinated, and districts accept people all the time
Right.
with a conditional permit that are not fully vaccinated.
So in other words, you could start school and school accept
Or
that your
preschool.
child can start school without actually meeting the entire legally required the number of vaccines and so forth. If there is a conditional acceptance, means that there's a declaration of intent that the pediatrician, working with the parent, has declared that we intend to get the child vaccinated and meet those requirements, but they're not meeting it at this point in time, and the schools have accepted that.
Is that in the bill?
That actually is existing policy. It doesn't need to be in the bill. It's not changed.
Okay, I believe that's current law, and
That's current
it's
law.
in another section.
Right.
Any additional questions, Ms. Burke? Do you have any follow-ups? Or
I have one other question for the opposition.
please?
For this gentleman here. I guess my question is, have you had any issues getting an exemption for your daughter?
We've been told that thank you for the question. Been told that my daughter does not qualify for a medical exemption because she's perfectly healthy. My child's neurologist doesn't dispute the fact with us that it was his early childhood vaccine that caused his epilepsy and mental delays. And he was even uncomfortable giving a medical exemption for Clayton because he said that under the letter of the law he could, even though it's narrowly construed, but he said there's just a lot of pressure in the medical field from giving it. But he said our daughter, who's perfectly healthy, and because there's no screenings that can be used to say, oh, she's got a predisposition, that she would not qualify. So for my daughter now, she attends our public school on a personal belief exemption. Thank you.
May I also respond to that? I would actually ask that I would invite families who have this problem to have their physician write a letter to that effect and send it to my office, declaring that they are uncomfortable giving a medical exemption because they feel that there is pressure or there's some other external influence aside from their professional judgment. I would point out that the medical board, to my knowledge, has never investigated or removed the license of a physician for granting a medical exemption for immunization that I'm aware of.
Thank you. Additional member questions. Assemblymember Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to echo a concern of Member Bonilla with respect to the fact that this is the only committee through which this bill is going. We have already heard testimony with respect to judicial questions. We have heard some member concerns with respect to the Education Committee. I do understand that it is outside of your purview over in the Senate, but part of my objection to the bill presently is that our Assembly we just simply have not been given the opportunity to vet and have public discourse and testimony with respect to judiciary issues and with respect to educational issues. And with all due respect to the Senate, I am not elected to the Senate. I've been elected to the Assembly. And I think other members should have been in these various committees. We know that's something we need to ask about our Rules Committee and the decisions that they've made. It tends to give me trouble because it appears that it is a rush job. And I think that does not do justice to the Assembly, to our processes, and to the judicial and educational issues. I want to make sure that I understand that California has high levels of vaccination. There was testimony with respect to 2014 having significantly high vaccination rates. I have seen reports, and there's been information that California has a 90% or better vaccination rate. I've also had information and have looked at your 2109. It is my understanding that since the inception of 2109, that there has been a decline in the requests overall in the state. Is that in dispute?
So what I would say is, first of all, and just actually it's interesting you bring up 2109, and I'm glad to see that the former opponents of 2109, because I was the author of that bill, are here in strong support. I know that both Ms. Fisher and Dr. Gordon were certainly not in support at the time. That bill also was only heard in the Assembly Health Committee when it was heard. That's most bills, it got heard by one policy committee as well. So it was also only heard, and I'm glad to see that the former opponents now support the bill. AB 2109 was modeled after a bill that was passed by the state of Washington. In the state of Washington, they had passed the bill actually prior to AB 2109, which actually just went into effect this school year. So although it was passed in 2012, its implementation did not begin until this school year. And you're right, we're very happy that it did have an impact. It reduced the PBEs by 19% after a 315% increase over the last 15 years. So we tried to make a dent. Unfortunately, as we looked at lessons from the bill that we modeled it after, because we were excited that the state of Washington, in their first year of implementation, which was 2012 when we passed AB 2109, they saw actually an over 20% decrease. And then there was no further decrease. That basically there was a population of people who because now they had to go see the doctor, they were able to get their immunizations, but that there was not a further decrease. So based on that, we are seeing that, unfortunately, we do not expect to see further decreases based on AB 2109, looking at what happened in the state of Washington. In fact, most recently, the state of Vermont, the governor who signed their bill to eliminate personal belief exemptions in the state of Vermont, one of the reasons he stated was there was a previous bill, it was different than 2109, but they had a bill requiring education of parents. He knew the fact that it didn't work, and that's why he was taking this further step. And unfortunately, what we saw with the state of Washington is that their bill, while it had that first year decrease, just like we saw a 1 year decrease in this bill, was not actually, again, having a persistent effect. And so, we're certainly very concerned about that, especially with the continuing the outbreak in Disneyland and other outbreaks that we're concerned about, that it's not, unfortunately, going to do the job to prevent outbreaks in our community. And that, again, this is a 19% decrease that followed over 300% increase in PBEs that have occurred prior to that decrease.
With respect to the level of vaccination in the state of California, is it or is it not high?
Well, one could actually, you just cited the fact that the immunization rate for entry to kindergarten is around 90%. It's actually a little over that. As I mentioned in my testimony, for measles, we'd like to try to get it up to at least 94, 95%. It's borderline, I would argue. But again, the issue is not because when you're in a community, in a school, it is not the whole state you're worried about, it's your immediate community. And what we're seeing there is you're seeing schools with immunization rates as low, as low as 50% or below. And in fact, when people have analyzed the measles outbreak that happened that began in Disneyland, there's analysis of that measles outbreak and where it spread in the state of California. And basically what they found was that where the measles spread, the immunization rates in those communities were ranging between 50% to about 84%. So clearly it spread through communities where there were low immunization rates. And I would point out that it's not a one-year phenomenon we're talking about in terms of immunization rates. It's a cumulative effect of year after year after year of adding to the number of unimmunized because of PBE. Each PBE is about an entering class right now, right? So someone gets a PBE, again, kindergarten, and then basically they stay unimmunized for most part. There's not huge numbers are coming in, then getting immunized later. So AMs are staying unimmunized, and you're adding with each year to the number of unimmunized people, and you're growing that population of people who are unimmunized. And when that population gets large enough in the community, it gets sizable enough, that's when there's the opportunity to fuel outbreaks. And basically those diseases like measles, like whooping cough, and others catch hold, and then they spread. And then also they, as was mentioned by Dr. Blumberg, they can even reach, there's a small portion of people even who are immunized who don't take to the vaccine sufficiently. So basically then that's how you end up with outbreaks, because you have a large enough base of unimmunized people to give the virus momentum to be able to spread. And that's the challenge that we're facing. If we want to stop outbreaks, we need to get our immunization rates higher, not just across the state, but also in individual communities as well, because otherwise those communities will become the basis and the seeds for outbreaks that will spread into other parts of the state that surround them.
Chairman Bonta, may I speak to answer Assemblyman Patterson's question?
No, sir.
The rules.
What we're going to do is we're going to have members ask questions. They may ask questions of your team, of opposing witnesses, and if Mr. Patterson would like to do that, he may. I'm just clarifying what we're doing here and what we're not doing.
Thank you.
Well, members are asking questions of witnesses and the author. We're not having colloquy between witnesses. We're not having colloquy between the author and witnesses. Mr. Patterson,
Thank you.
Your next question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you consider that the measles outbreak rises to the level of an epidemic or rises to the level of a significant and serious health emergency?
I would say it represents a serious outbreak, especially when you have at least 20 people who got hospitalized. And you heard the story of the young child who was exposed and actually got infected with measles in infancy, who now is dying. So we will have a death from measles. We've actually had deaths from measles over the past 12 years from these long-term sequelae of measles. That every one of those people who got measles, the 130 people who got measles, they are at risk in the next, over the next 10 years of developing a deadly sequelae of SSPE, which is what the infant you just heard the story from is dying of. So this is not something that's going away just because, the outbreak's over and now we don't have any further measles. Yes, we don't have any more further contagious measles, but those people are still at risk of potentially getting a more serious complication later on. Okay. These are serious diseases that can kill. And let's not diminish the seriousness of what happened.
Well, I'm trying to, frankly, determine the scope of the problem that you're trying to address in light of the significance of the consequences to those who are choosing to ask for and have facilitated the personal exemption. It is hard for me to understand in the context of an epidemic, an outbreak, 100, and then none. And the concern that I have, and I'd like to ask this final question, do you think that the small number in the state of California, I understand it was 1%, is that correct? In the state of California, maybe it's 2% that have these exemptions?
It's higher than that.
2.5%? Mm-hmm. Do you consider that rises to the level of risk that this small group should be isolated from a public education and segregated from a fundamental right to an education? We
are protecting the right to an education. We've worked hard to do that. We are not segregating them. We realize that people who are making choices, there are consequences associated to protect the public. And when we talk about, we can talk about the 130-some people who got measles, but there's many other people who got exposed. As I mentioned in my testimony, we've been fortunate to be able to have an era where we did not have to see signs in stores telling you that if you went to this store, you might have been exposed to a disease like measles or some other disease, that you don't have to worry about getting on a subway or a bus and being exposed to serious illness, that you're not getting notes from your child's school that they might have been exposed because somebody in the school had chicken pox or measles or whooping cough. That is not the kind of society I think most of us want to see happen. That's the people, vast majority of people support vaccinations because they don't want to see that kind of society. That's not what they want. They want to be in fear that their child or their loved one is going to be exposed to a deadly disease when they walk into a store, when they drop their kids off at school, when they go ride on public transit, go to other public places, go visit Disneyland. That is not what we want to have happen. And so this bill addresses a problem. We had, it's not just the one outbreak. That outbreak's over, you're right. It's the next one. And the next one that follows after that. And we know that those are going to be on the way if we don't do something. Studies have looked at, there's been published studies analyzing the pertussis outbreaks, this measles outbreaks, other outbreaks, and they trace it back to personal belief exemption rates as being one of the major factors. So yes, in pertussis, we're using a vaccine that has fewer side effects and perhaps doesn't last as long. And so when you talk about people who were vaccinated, who got pertussis, yes, we know pertussis wears off. All right, measles vaccination, chickenpox vaccination, many of the other vaccines don't. A flu vaccine only lasts for a year. That doesn't mean that we don't get people vaccinated, and that doesn't mean that they don't provide protection. It does mean that perhaps we need to do boosters more frequently to be sure that that protection remains. But there are children who have died. There are children who are dying from these diseases, and we don't need to see them return. And that's what I think the public expects from us here. That's what they expect of all of you. That's what they're expecting from me. That's what they're expecting from all our colleagues. That's what we're here to prevent.
Thank you.
And actually, every health organization, you look at the list of all the health organizations that are supporting this bill, as well as education organizations, as well as child advocacy groups, other organizations, they all are doing that because they know this is the solution to trying to stop a impending problem that we already saw the very beginning of.